Okay, in this next video lecture here, we're going to talk about some different erythrocyte disorders you guys should be familiar with. And the first one is a pretty obvious one, anemia. Anemia means that you have blood with an abnormally low oxygen carrying capacity. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have too few red blood cells, maybe, although that is usually the case. It's really about the function of blood and whether or not you're able to transport adequate oxygen gas to your tissues. Anemia is often a sign. A sign is something that can be observed by, you might wonder what's the difference between a sign and a symptom. A symptom is perceived by the patient. A sign is something that can actually be observed by a nurse, a physician, or detected on a laboratory test. So usually it is a sign of some other type of disease that is causing the anemia. Now here, over here on this diagram, pretty good diagram showing you various symptoms that can occur with anemia. And some of these would be signs as well. Things like fatigue, dizziness, fainting, lower blood pressure, lots of different things. Look over here, changed stool color, changed color of the feces. We know why is that. We just talked about how on the last video clip it's actually the bilirubin that gets broken down and converted into stercobilin by bacteria in your intestinal tract that leads to the major color component of your stool. So all these things make sense once you start putting all these stories together. Shortness of breath. Why would you be short of breath? You know, why would you be gasping for air if you were anemic? Because that's a response by your body to take in more O2. We got to get more O2 in here. All right, if you have anemia, you're not getting enough O2 to your tissues to support cellular respiration. It almost always comes back to that. So again, you'll be fatigued. Obviously, you're fatigued because you're not getting enough O2 to your tissues. They're not able to crank out enough ATP to supply your energy needs. Pallor, that's a term for looking pale, which makes sense if you don't have adequate red blood cells or you're not transporting adequate oxygen to all of your tissues. Guess what's going to happen? That blood's going to wind up getting conserved for vital organs like the brain and your major internal organs, and so you won't be sending as much blood to the surface of the skin, which is not quite as vital for your survival. Shortness of breath, chills, makes sense as well. You're going to get more cold when you are anemic, and if you're experiencing this blood being kept deeper inside the body, it can make you feel kind of chilly. Okay, different types of anemia, or what causes anemia. Blood loss, of course, is a major cause. All right, so hemorrhagic anemia. Hemorrhagic is a term you guys should be familiar with. And that's where you're losing blood because blood vessels have been ripped open, like if you were stabbed or injured in some other way. So that has to be treated through blood replacement. That makes sense. Now you can also have chronic hemorrhagic anemia. This term chronic usually refers to something that's long lasting, maybe not quite as severe, but it goes on for a long period of time. Like you can have chronic arthritis, for example. And this is where you might have some bleeding that's going on, maybe internally, like if you had an ulcer, or hemorrhoids. Those are actually weakened veins. The walls of veins in the anal area have become weakened and they're leaking blood. And so over time, that could lead to enough blood loss to cause anemia. All right, another cause of anemia would be low red blood cell production, and or you might make defective red blood cells. And not a surprise, iron deficiency anemia is one type. And I think we've probably all heard before that not having enough iron in your diet can lead to anemia. So this can actually be caused due to hemorrhaging, low iron intake in your diet, or another possibility is you're not absorbing iron from your diet as well. Like if you have some sort of a problem along your intestinal lining and you're not able to absorb as much iron from the foods that you're consuming. All right, so in terms of if you looked at the cells, red blood cells of a patient who has iron deficiency anemia under the microscope, they would have what are called microcytic, which literally means small cells. Hypochromic means low color. So if you see over here, see all these red blood cells over here, how they have that really pronounced white center and just a little bit of a pink coloration around the edges. The pink coloration on there is due to hemoglobin picking up the pink dye that's used in these stains. And so that whitish center that you see there is an indicator that there's not much hemoglobin around. So this can be treated with iron supplements. All right, then another type of anemia is called pernicious anemia. Okay, and pernicious anemia occurs, it's actually an autoimmune disease, like we were talking about in the last unit, where type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. A patient's immune system is unfortunately attacking some of their own tissues. And in this case, it destroys some of the stomach mucosa. That's the inner lining of the stomach, mucosa. The stomach actually makes a protein called intrinsic factor, and that's made by the stomach, and it goes to the small intestine and it signals the uptake of vitamin B12. So you get vitamin B12 from the foods that you eat or for vitamin supplements, but you need this intrinsic factor that's made by the stomach to travel down into the small intestine and tell the small intestine to absorb that vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is needed for mitosis, DNA. You need that for mitosis, cell division. So without it, your red blood cells, and you're constantly cranking out new red blood cells, they can't divide properly. And so some of those, if you think about that red blood cell pathway, and how one cell leads to the next, so you actually have cells that stop dividing and they become very large cells because of that, called macrocytes. So iron deficiency, you wind up with microcytic red blood cells, little tiny ones that lack color. With pernicious anemia, the way it can be detected if you're looking at these cells under a microscope is that you'll have these big gigantic types of cells that are not dividing and breaking apart into red blood cells. This can be treated with B12 injections. Maybe you've heard of that before, or there's even a nasal gel where vitamin B12 can be absorbed through the nose. Vegetarians have to be careful with this as well, because sometimes vegetarians don't get enough vitamin B12 in their diet. All right, another type of anemia, renal anemia, and we mentioned this on an earlier video lecture. The kidneys make EPO, so if you have suffered kidney damage or your kidneys are not functioning properly, you might not be making enough EPO, and so then your red bone marrow is not receiving enough signals to crank out more red blood cells. All right, so that makes sense. This can be treated though with synthetic EPO. That's stuff that athletes sometimes abuse. It does have some good functions as well. All right, another bad type of anemia that can occur is aplastic anemia, and this is where the red bone marrow has become destroyed, or the cell division that would normally be taking place there is inhibited. There are various things that can cause this. A lot of times you don't know what's causing it, but it can be. There are various types of drugs that you might be taking for some reason, including chemotherapy drugs. Chemotherapy drugs that are used to kill cancer cells. Unfortunately, they also, how those drugs usually work is they inhibit cell division. Rapidly dividing cells, like cancer cells, are sensitive to those drugs. But guess what? In your red bone marrow, you constantly have cell division going on as well. And so many of those types of drugs will also inhibit hematopoiesis, which can lead you to not having as many red blood cells. It can also lead to you not having as many white blood cells, so you have trouble fighting infections. And you may have seen there, I've seen some infomercials on TV pretty frequently about, if you're taking chemotherapy for cancer, here's a drug that you can take to help stimulate more red blood cell production to help you help treat anemia. Chemicals, radiation exposure could cause anemia if it damages your red bone marrow. And then there are even some viruses that can infect the red bone marrow and cause problems. Again, this type of anemia, all cell lines are affected, so it's not just the red blood cell production that's usually screwed up. Your white blood cell production is as well. Your platelet production is also, so you're going to have trouble with clotting, and your immune system is not going to function properly. All right, treatment, short-term blood transfusions. Long-term, if your red blood cell bone marrow just does not come back, like maybe it was overly damaged due to something like radiation exposure, you may need hemocytoblasts transplanted in from a donor with a good match to you so that you can actually regenerate your bone marrow. All right, anemias can also be caused by high red blood cell destruction. For example, red blood cells might lyse. Lysis means to break apart. So they might do that prematurely before their 100 to 120 days are up. Sometimes that's caused due to abnormalities of hemoglobin, and those are usually genetic type diseases that you would inherit. If you get the wrong blood type in a blood transfusion, it's incompatible. You know, for example, like if you had type O blood and you accidentally got transfused with type A, we'll be learning more about that later. Your immune system would actually respond by destroying those transfused red blood cells, would cause them to burst. There are also infections that can cause red blood cells to burst. Some types of bacteria that we become infected with can, in some cases, cause red blood cells to burst. An example of a type of anemia that involves high red blood cell production, thalassemia, you may have heard of that before. It's pretty rare. It mainly only occurs in people who have Mediterranean ancestry. Some Jewish populations have cases of thalassemia. And what's happening here is one of the globin proteins is either in your hemoglobins is either absent or faulty. So, you know, you're supposed to have 4 proteins per hemoglobin molecule, and so if you're missing one or it's faulty, your hemoglobins are not going to work properly. You're not going to be able to transport oxygen gas around to all of the different parts of your body. So this can be extremely severe. Obviously, if your hemoglobin is severely screwed up and you can't deliver oxygen gas to your tissues, that's going to be really bad news. In other cases, the hemoglobin proteins may be faulty but not super screwed up, so they're still capable of, your hemoglobins are still capable of binding oxygen gas. They're just not quite as good at it as they would be if they were completely normal. All right, and then a very important type of anemia you guys will certainly hear about and work with patients who have this condition, sickle cell anemia. And sickle cell anemia primarily occurs in people who have ancestry from Africa. And what's happening in these patients is they have a mutation in their beta globin protein. So remember, your hemoglobins are built from 2 beta globins and 2 alpha globin proteins complex together. And proteins are chains of amino acids. We got a bunch of amino acids linked together. In people who have sickle cell anemia, their beta globins have one single amino acid that's wrong. So they have an amino acid there, but it's the wrong one. It's been substituted with the incorrect amino acid at a particular position in that chain. And what happens is the hemoglobin proteins, under conditions of low O2, the hemoglobin proteins tend to clump together and inside the red blood cells, and the red blood cells take on a sickled shape like you see here. They become elongated. That's where the sickle cell anemia gets its name. And those red blood cells that look like that, they rupture really easily. And then, like they're showing you over here in this diagram, they can clump together and block entry into capillaries with narrow channels. And then that cuts off the oxygen supply to tissues. So tissues can become hypoxic, not receiving enough oxygen supply, and that can cause pain as those tissues become damaged. Sickle cell anemia can be very painful. And you can also have tissues that die if the oxygen gas transport is cut off for a really long period of time. So when the red blood cells have adequate O2, they tend to look normal. It's when the hemoglobins unload that oxygen gas in tissues and they become low in O2 amounts that they take on, the hemoglobins tend to clump together in those cells, and the red blood cells take on that sickling type shape. Okay, so sickle cell anemia is a disease that primarily occurs in people of African ancestry, black Africans who come from, or if your ancestry comes from people from the parts of Africa where malaria happens to occur very frequently. And the reason that is, why did this mutation, this is a genetic mutation that leads to these hemoglobin S proteins being made. Well, why did this develop in that part of Africa? It's actually pretty interesting. It's because, all right, so guys know you have 2 copies of each of your genes. You get one from mom and you get one from dad. Well, if you have 1 copy of that hemoglobin S gene, then you have the other copy that you inherited from your other parent makes normal beta globin. In that case, you have what's called sickle cell trait, because you're making some good beta globins and you're making some of the mutant forms. And you have a milder disease. These patients sometimes have problems, but not nearly as frequently as if you have sickle cell anemia. But what happened was this mutation developed in Africa a long time ago, because if you have sickle cell trait, you are more likely to survive malaria. Malaria is a microorganism, or is caused by a microorganism that invades your red blood cells and multiplies inside them and causes them to die. So if you have sickle cell trait, you are more resistant to malaria, made it more likely that you are going to survive in the parts of Africa where malaria is very prevalent, and then it made it more likely you were going to pass that sickle cell trait gene down to your offspring and your children. So that gene became pretty widespread in the populations of the people who lived in black Africa, the black portions of Africa. Unfortunately, if you wind up with 2 copies of that bad gene, though, that's when you develop sickle cell anemia and have a lot more health problems, and that could actually wind up killing you if it's not treated. So it's kind of a trade-off there. If you live in Africa, whether you're going to be more likely to survive malaria or whether you're going to wind up developing this really nasty illness. Okay, what about on the flip side? So we've been talking about anemia, where you have too few or defective red blood cells. What if you have too many? Having too many or excessive red blood cells is called polycythemia. And polycythemia vera is actually a type of cancer. It's a bone marrow cancer. Cancers occur when cells are dividing in an out of control manner. And producing too many copies of a particular cell type that then spread throughout the body. So polycythemia vera is due to excess red blood cells being formed. Major problem with that, your blood becomes too viscous, too thick, and that raises your blood pressure. You know, kind of like if you were trying to pass syrup or something through a garden hose, the pressure inside that hose would go up as compared to water flowing through it. Same thing with your blood. Secondary polycythemia is different. Okay, so this is where you wind up cranking out an excessive number of red blood cells, and it's due to our homeostatic response that your body is making. For example, like we talked about before, let's say you moved from Alabama to a location with a very high altitude, you know, like 12, 13, 14, 15,000 feet, or you were going to go climb Mount Everest or something. Well, there's a lot less oxygen gas available at those higher elevations, which is going to stimulate your kidneys to crank out more EPO, which will then cause your red bone marrow to make more red blood cells. And as long as you're not cranking out too many of them, this is advantageous. This secondary polycythemia is going to help you because you need more red blood cells to capture the O2 that is available so that all of your tissues will have an adequate supply. This can also be caused by blood doping, and that's where athletes take EPO injections to increase their red blood cell levels. Yes, that does help with their athletic performance because you have more red blood cells dropping off more oxygen gas with your skeletal muscles, so your skeletal muscles can make more ATP more quickly, which they need to help you power through things like a long bicycle ride or a long run. All right, so that pretty much concludes our red blood cell story. In the next video lecture, we're going to move on and talk about the leukocytes, your white blood cells, in more detail. And we are going to talk about them some here in Unit 2, Chapter 17. We'll talk about their functions, though, in more detail when we get to the immune system in Unit 3. Like I just said, we're not going to talk about them now in Unit 3, and then we are in Unit 3. We're not going to talk about them quite as much here in Unit 2, and then we will talk about them quite a bit more when we cover the immune system in Unit 3.